In 1975, a 24-year-old engineer walked into a meeting room carrying a device he had built with his own hands. It was ugly. It weighed about 8 pounds. It was the size of a toaster, cobbled together from spare parts, a cassette mechanism, and a lens borrowed from a movie camera. It took 23 seconds to capture a single black and white image at a resolution so low it would embarrass a modern doorbell. But it worked. The young engineer connected it to a television, and there, on the screen, appeared a photograph that had never touched film. No chemicals, no paper, no darkroom, just light, captured by a sensor, turned into numbers, and displayed on a screen. It was the first digital camera ever built, and the engineer who built it, a man named Stephen Sasson, had just invented the future of photography. He worked for one of the most powerful and beloved corporations on the planet, a company that, at its peak, controlled around 90% of the film sold in the United States. A company so dominant that taking a photograph was simply called, by everyone, a Kodak moment. He brought the future to his employer. He showed them the photograph on the screen. He showed them what was coming. And his employer's reaction, the reaction of the company that owned photography itself, was, in essence, "That's cute. Now don't tell anyone about it." That company was Kodak. And in that room, in 1975, holding the invention that would eventually destroy them, Kodak made a choice. They chose to bury it. Today, the company that invented the digital camera no longer exists as the giant it once was. It went bankrupt. The 90% empire collapsed. The Kodak moment became a phrase people use, with irony, to describe a company that saw its own death coming decades in advance and looked away. This is not the story of a company that missed the future. That is the comfortable lie. The truth is far stranger and far more damning. Kodak did not miss the future. Kodak invented the future, patented the future, understood the future, and then made a deliberate, reasoned, repeated decision to suffocate it in its crib, because the future threatened the thing that was making them rich. This is the story of how a company killed itself with its own invention. The weapon and the victim were the same. My name is unimportant. What matters is the body on the table, and today, the body is Kodak. Let's begin the autopsy. To understand the scale of what Kodak threw away, you first have to understand how completely it had won. The Eastman Kodak Company was founded in 1888 by a man named George Eastman in Rochester, New York. And Eastman was not just an inventor, he was a strategist of rare genius. Because Eastman understood something about business that most people never grasp, and that would, a century later, become the very trap that destroyed his company. Eastman understood the razor and the blades. In the early days of photography, taking a picture was a nightmare. It required heavy glass plates, toxic chemicals, and the skill of a trained professional. Eastman's breakthrough was not just to make photography easier, it was to give away, or nearly give away, the camera, and to make all the money on the film. His slogan said it all. You press the button, we do the rest. You bought a cheap, simple Kodak camera. You took your photographs, and then you sent the entire camera back to Kodak, where they developed the film, printed the pictures, reloaded it, and sent it back to you. Every step after pressing the button belonged to Kodak, and every step generated revenue. The camera was the razor, the film was the blades, and Kodak owned the only blades in town. This model made Kodak one of the most profitable companies in the history of the world. Film was a chemical product with extraordinary margins. Once the factories were built and the formulas perfected, each roll of film cost very little to produce and sold for a great deal. And people bought film constantly. Every birthday, every wedding, every holiday, every vacation, every newborn child. All of it ran through Kodak film and Kodak paper and Kodak chemicals. For most of the 20th century, Kodak's dominance was not really a competition. It was closer to a tax. A tax on memory itself. If you wanted to hold on to a moment, you paid Kodak for the privilege. At its height, Kodak employed around 145,000 people. It controlled roughly 90% of film sales and 85% of camera sales in the United States. Its brand was, by some measures, one of the most recognized and trusted on the entire planet, ranked alongside Coca-Cola. The town of Rochester, New York, was essentially built around it. Its schools, its hospitals, its culture, its prosperity, all flowing from the yellow-boxed empire. This was not a company. It was an institution. It felt as permanent as the sun. To understand just how deep this went, consider the town of Rochester itself. Kodak did not just employ the city, it raised it. The company built recreation centers for its workers. It funded the hospitals. It poured money into the university. It paid wages so generous and benefits so complete that a job at Kodak was considered a job for life, passed in spirit from parent to child. Generations of families spent their entire working lives inside the yellow box empire, confident that it would outlast them and their children and their children's children. Kodak even shaped how the world remembered itself. The phrase "a Kodak moment" entered the language as a way of describing any scene worth preserving. A wedding kiss, a first step, a graduation. Think about the sheer power of that. The company had so thoroughly captured the act of remembering that its brand name became the word people used for happiness worth keeping. You did not photograph your life. You Kodaked it. And the financial engine beneath all this warmth was cold and merciless in its efficiency. Film was a consumable. You used it up. You needed more. Forever. Unlike a car or a refrigerator, which you buy once a decade, film was bought again and again and again, in an endless loop of birthdays and vacations and newborns. Kodak had found the holy grail of business, a product the world consumed continuously, that only it could supply, protected by decades of chemical patents and manufacturing secrets that no competitor could easily match. And it was built entirely on one assumption: that people would always need film. Remember that assumption, because everything that follows, the genius, the blindness, the slow suicide, all of it flows from the moment that assumption stopped being true, and Kodak refused to believe it. Now we return to that room in 1975. and to Stephen Sasson, the young engineer holding the future. It is worth slowing down here, because this moment is the cleanest, sharpest example of a fatal decision you will ever find in business history. There is no ambiguity, no bad luck, no external disaster, just a company looking directly at its own future and choosing to look away. Sasson had been given a vague assignment by his bosses at Kodak to see whether a device called a charge-coupled device, a light sensor, might have any practical use. It was the kind of open-ended research project a rich company hands to a junior engineer without expecting much. Kodak, to its credit, funded enormous amounts of pure research. It had one of the great corporate laboratories in the world, and out of that lab, Sasson built something nobody had asked for and nobody was ready for: a camera with no film. When he presented it to Kodak's management, the engineers were intrigued by the technical achievement, but the business leaders, the people who understood where Kodak's money actually came from, asked the questions that mattered to them. And those questions revealed the trap the company was already standing in, without knowing it. Why, they asked, would anyone want to look at their photographs on a television screen? And more importantly, and this is the question that contained the company's death sentence, if people stopped printing photographs, what would happen to film? That was the real issue. Sasson himself later recalled the essence of the reaction. The technology was interesting, but it was filmless photography, and Kodak was a film company. The invention did not open a door for them. It threatened to burn down the house they lived in. So the decision was made, not to kill the research outright. Kodak kept developing the underlying technology quietly for years, even patenting key elements of digital photography. But the decision was made to keep it contained, to not let it threaten the core business, to treat the future as a science experiment rather than a strategy. Sasson was, in his own words, told that it was cute, but to not tell anyone about it. Sit with the horror of that for a moment. The most important invention in the history of the company. The thing that would define the next 50 years of an entire industry. And the instruction from the top was, effectively, hide it. Here is the part that makes this an autopsy and not a fairy tale. The people who made that decision were not idiots. From where they sat in 1975, the decision was rational. Digital imaging was decades away from being good enough or cheap enough to replace film. The technology in Sasson's hands was genuinely primitive, and meanwhile, the film business was a money-printing machine of almost unimaginable profitability. Why would you spend money to develop a product that was worse than what you sold, in order to destroy the most profitable business on earth, to chase a market that did not yet exist? It sounds insane to invest in digital. From inside the logic of 1975, burying it was the sensible thing to do. And that is the lesson hiding inside this entire story. The lesson we will return to again and again. The fatal decision almost never looks fatal at the time. It looks responsible. It looks prudent. It looks like protecting the business. The poison and the medicine often look identical going down. You only learn which one you swallowed decades later. Before we follow the body further down, I want to ask you something directly. If you find this kind of autopsy valuable, if you want to understand not just that great companies die, but the exact decision in the exact room that kills them, then subscribe to this channel. Every episode, we lay one fallen empire on the table, and we find the true cause of death. It costs you nothing, and it makes sure the next examination finds its way to you. Now, back to the body. For a while, the decision to bury digital looked not just defensible, but brilliant. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, Kodak's film business kept growing. Color film, instant film, film for movies, film for medicine, film for science. The world's hunger for images seemed bottomless, and every image meant more film. Kodak's revenues climbed into the billions. Its profits were enormous. Its stock was a cornerstone of American retirement accounts. Owning Kodak was considered as safe as owning the country itself. And here is where the trap deepened, quietly, in a way that almost no one inside the company could feel. Every year that film remained dominant, Kodak became more dependent on it. More factories dedicated to film. More employees whose entire careers were built on film chemistry. More executives who had risen through the film business and thought in the language of film. More investors who expected the fat film profits to continue forever. The company was not just selling film, it had become film. Its identity, its expertise, its culture, its cost structure, its very soul were all fused to a chemical product, and an organism that has become one thing cannot easily become another. This is what business writers would later call the innovator's dilemma. The very things that make a company successful, its focus, its scale, its expertise, its profitable core, become the chains that prevent it from changing when the world changes. The better you are at the old thing, the harder it is to embrace the new thing, especially when the new thing is worse, cheaper, and threatens to cannibalize everything you have. And digital, for a long time, was exactly that. Worse. The early digital cameras of the 1990s were expensive, clumsy, and produced images far inferior to film. Any executive could hold up a digital photo next to a film print and say, with complete honesty, "See? Film is better. We have time." They were right about the photo. They were catastrophically wrong about the time. Because here is what they failed to understand about digital technology, and what almost everyone fails to understand about it even now. Digital does not improve in a straight line. It improves exponentially. It gets better and cheaper, not gradually, but in accelerating leaps, doubling and doubling again, until one day, the thing that was a laughable toy becomes, almost overnight, good enough, and then better, and then unstoppable. While Kodak's executives were comparing a single digital photo to a single film print and feeling reassured, the entire foundation of their world was being rebuilt beneath their feet at a speed they could not perceive. The iceberg was not approaching slowly. It only looked slow because they were so very large. Now, I have to be fair to Kodak, because a true autopsy does not flatter the prosecution. It would be easy to say Kodak simply sat still and did nothing while digital arrived. That is not what happened, and the truth is far more painful. Kodak did try. The company was not blind in the way people imagine. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Kodak understood that digital was coming. They could see the market shifting, and they invested, billions of dollars in fact, into digital products. Kodak built digital cameras. In fact, for a period, Kodak was one of the leading sellers of digital cameras in the United States. The company that had buried the digital camera in 1975 was now, decades later, actually selling them in large numbers. So if Kodak saw it coming, and Kodak built the products, why did Kodak still die? This is the heart of the autopsy, and the answer reveals the second fatal decision, the one that turned a difficult situation into a fatal one. The problem was how Kodak entered digital. They entered it as a film company desperately trying to remain a film company. They were not trying to win the digital future. They were trying to use digital to protect the film past. Look at the strategy. When Kodak sold digital cameras, it often did so at a loss or at razor-thin margins, hoping to make the money back where it had always made money, on printing. The whole plan was built around the belief that even in a digital world, people would still want physical prints of their photos. So Kodak poured energy into photo kiosks, into printing services, into ways of turning digital images back into paper. They were trying to drag the digital future back into the film business model that had made them rich. They were trying to make digital photography pay a toll to film. But the customers did not want to pay that toll. The whole point of digital, the thing people loved about it, was freedom from the old chemical ritual. People did not want to print most of their photos. They wanted to take 1,000 pictures for free, look at them on a screen, delete the bad ones, and share the good ones. The behavior Kodak's entire strategy depended on, printing, was the exact behavior that digital made unnecessary. Kodak had built its lifeboat out of the same material as the sinking ship, and this is the deeper, more disturbing truth about the company's death. Kodak's failure was not a failure to invent. Kodak invented constantly. It was not even, purely, a failure to invest. Kodak invested heavily. It was a failure of identity. The company could never bring itself to stop being a film company. Every digital move it made was bent, distorted, and ultimately broken by the gravitational pull of the business it could not let go of. It is one thing to be unable to see the future. It is another, far rarer and far sadder thing to see the future, build the future, sell the future, and still be destroyed by it, because you could not stop loving your past. And now I have to show you the cruelest detail in this entire autopsy, a detail that turns the story from a tragedy into something closer to a dark joke that the universe played on Kodak. Remember that Kodak invented digital photography in 1975. And remember that, even while burying the product, the company kept quietly developing and patenting the underlying technology for years. Kodak ended up holding a vast portfolio of fundamental patents covering digital imaging, the very building blocks of how digital cameras capture and process light. Here is the joke. For years, as the rest of the world rushed into digital photography, every other company that built a digital camera, the Japanese giants, the electronics firms, the eventual smartphone makers, Many of them had to license Kodak's patents to do it. Kodak, the company being killed by digital, was collecting enormous sums of money from the very industry that was killing it. At its peak, this patent licensing brought in hundreds of millions, by some accounts billions, of dollars. Stop and absorb what that means. Kodak was, in effect, being paid a toll by its own executioners. It owned the intellectual foundation of the digital revolution. It had, sitting in its vaults, the legal rights to the future it had refused to build. And what did Kodak do with that extraordinary, almost miraculous second chance? This river of money flowing in from the future itself. It used much of it to prop up the dying film business and to fund a digital strategy that, as we have seen, was bent and broken by its loyalty to film. The patent money was not a foundation for reinvention. It was, too often, life support for the past. It was a transfusion that kept the old body breathing a little longer, instead of being used to grow a new one. And then, as Kodak's situation grew desperate in its final years, the company began selling off those very patents, the crown jewels, the legal deed to the digital age, for cash to survive. The treasure that could have funded a true transformation was instead sold, piece by piece, to keep the lights on a little longer. Kodak had been handed the future twice, once as an invention in 1975, and again as a fortune in patent royalties decades later. And both times, it used the gift to defend the past instead of building the future. That is not bad luck. That is a pattern, and the pattern is the disease. I want to pause the timeline here, because this is the part of the autopsy that matters most. Not what Kodak did, why it did it. Because if you only learn what happened, you learn nothing useful. You will simply watch it happen again, to other companies, perhaps to your own, and feel surprised every time. So let us ask the uncomfortable question. How does a company full of brilliant scientists and experienced executives, a company that literally invented the technology that would kill it, that held the patents, that understood the science better than anyone alive, how does that company walk, with open eyes, into its own grave? The answer is three forces, and these three forces live inside every successful organization on Earth, including, very possibly, the one you work for right now. The first force is the tyranny of the profitable core. Film was not just profitable for Kodak. It was almost obscenely profitable. The margins on film were among the best in all of industry. And when a single business is generating that much money, asking the company to nurture a new business that is less profitable and that will by design destroy the profitable one feels like madness. Every quarter, the film money rolls in, real and measurable. The digital future is just a story, a projection, a maybe. And so, again and again, the certain, fat, present profit wins the argument against the thin, uncertain, future one. The company optimizes for the world it lives in, right up until that world disappears. The second force is the prison of identity and expertise. Kodak had spent a century becoming the greatest film chemistry company in history. Its 145,000 employees were experts in coating, in emulsions, in dyes, in the molecular science of capturing light, on a strip of acetate. Digital photography did not need any of that. It needed software engineers, sensor designers, electronics specialists. To go fully digital, Kodak would have had to declare that its century of accumulated genius, the very thing that made it Kodak, was now worthless. No organization can easily say that about itself. The expertise that makes you great becomes the anchor that holds you in place. You keep solving the problem you are good at, even when it is no longer the problem that matters. The third force is the one that seals the coffin. The pressure of being a beloved, dominant, publicly traded institution. Kodak could not quietly suffer for a decade while it reinvented itself into something unrecognizable. It was a giant employer, a pillar of a city, a fixture of the stock market, judged every 90 days on its profits. Investors wanted the film dividends to keep flowing. The town of Rochester depended on the factories. The pressure from every direction was to protect what existed. The jobs, the profits, the identity. Not to burn it all down in a desperate bet on a hostile new world. Greatness creates a vast web of people who need you to stay exactly as you are. And that web, however well-intentioned, becomes a net that traps you in the past. Put those three forces together, and you get something that looks, from the outside, like stupidity. But it was never stupidity. The people inside Kodak could see digital coming. Some of them, like Sasson, saw it in 1975. They were not blind to the iceberg. It was that turning the ship, fully, painfully, at the cost of the profits, the identity, and the jobs that defined them, was so agonizing that they kept telling themselves there was still time. Still time. Still time. Right up until the water closed over the deck. This is the disease that kills giants. It is not weakness. It is not ignorance. It is the perfectly rational, perfectly human refusal to destroy your comfortable present in order to survive an uncertain future. And it has killed far more than Kodak. It killed the great newspaper companies that watched the internet arrive. It killed the phone giants that watched the smartphone arrive. It killed the video rental empire that watched streaming arrive. In every case, the victims were not fools. They were comfortable, and they were profitable, and they could not bear to set fire to the thing that was keeping them rich. Comfort, at the very top of the mountain, is the most expensive feeling in the world. Now, let us watch the giant fall. The fall, when it finally came, had the same shape these falls always have. Slowly, then all at once. Through the early 2000s, digital cameras improved at that relentless exponential pace, exactly as the technology promised and the executives feared. The images got better, the prices dropped. The cameras got smaller, and the behavior of an entire species changed. People stopped buying film. This was the moment, the great assumption. The assumption Kodak had been built on for over a century, the assumption that people would always need film, finally and completely collapsed. And when it collapsed, it did not collapse gently. Film sales did not gracefully decline. They fell off a cliff. The market that had been the foundation of one of the world's great fortunes simply evaporated, faster than almost anyone had modeled. The money printing machine, the razor and blades empire, The tax on memory itself, it stopped. And Kodak, having spent decades trying to drag digital into the film model instead of abandoning film for digital, was standing in precisely the wrong place when the ground gave way. Then came a second blow that not even the digital camera business could survive: the smartphone. Because here is the final, brutal irony. Just as Kodak was scrambling to establish itself in digital cameras, the digital camera itself was about to be devoured. The phone in everyone's pocket became the camera, free, always present, connected to the entire world for instant sharing. The standalone digital camera market, the future Kodak had finally, belatedly chased, was itself swallowed almost whole. Kodak had spent decades arriving late to a destination that was, itself, about to be demolished. And there was a final, internal cruelty to how the end unfolded, a contradiction that lived inside the company's own walls. By the 2000s, Kodak was a house divided against itself. On one side were the people of film, the chemists, the factory veterans, the executives who had built their careers and their fortunes on the old empire and who fought, consciously or not, to protect it. On the other side were the digital believers who understood that the only way forward was to let film die and to pour everything into the new world. Every budget meeting became a quiet civil war between the past and the future. And in that war, the past held most of the power, most of the money, and most of the votes, because the past was where the profits still came from. The future could never win an argument inside a company whose entire structure was built to defend the past. So the company tore itself in two directions at once and moved decisively in neither. The numbers tell the rest. The company that had employed around 145,000 people shrank and shrank and shrank. Factories that had run for generations went silent. Entire divisions were sold off for cash. The great manufacturing complexes around Rochester, the beating heart of the empire, were dismantled, demolished, emptied. The stock that had been a symbol of American stability, a safe haven in every prudent retirement portfolio, slid toward worthlessness, wiping out the savings of people who had trusted it, precisely because it had always seemed unkillable. And behind every one of those numbers was a human cost. Tens of thousands of families in Rochester, whose security had been built, across generations, on the promise that Kodak would always be there. The job for life turned out not to be for life. The institution that had raised a city could no longer sustain it. A company dying slowly does not just take its shareholders down with it. It takes the towns, the families, the quiet assumptions of permanence that thousands of people had built their existence upon. In January 2012, the Eastman Kodak Company, founded in 1888, the company that invented roll film, that put a camera in every home, that defined photography for over a century, that invented the digital camera itself, filed for bankruptcy. The company emerged from bankruptcy later, smaller, transformed into a shadow of itself, focused on commercial printing and other niche businesses. It survived, in a sense. But the empire was gone. The 90% dominance was gone. The institution was gone. What remained was a name, attached to a much smaller and humbler enterprise, haunted forever by the question of what it had thrown away. So what killed Kodak? The comfortable answer is digital, or smartphones, or technological change. That is the answer that lets every executive watching this sleep soundly tonight, because it makes Kodak's death feel like an act of nature, an asteroid, something nobody could have prevented. But you have seen the evidence yourself, and the evidence does not support that verdict. Kodak was not killed by digital photography. Kodak invented digital photography. Kodak was not killed by failing to see the future. Kodak saw the future in 1975, held it in its hands, and put it back in the drawer. Kodak was not killed by an inability to build digital products. Kodak built them, sold millions of them, and was for a time a leader in the very market it had feared. Every weapon that destroyed Kodak was a weapon Kodak had forged itself, held in its own hands, and chosen, again and again, not to wield. The cause of death was not the technology. The cause of death was the decision, a repeated, deliberate, rational decision to protect the profitable past at the expense of the threatening future. A company so in love with the thing that had made it rich that it could not bear to become the thing that would keep it alive. And like all the giants we lay on this table, Kodak did not die from one fatal decision. It died from the same fatal decision, made over and over across 37 years. The decision to bury the camera in 1975. The decision to treat digital as a science experiment through the 80s. The decision to chain digital to film printing in the 90s and 2000s. The decision, at every fork in the road, to protect what it had instead of risking everything to become what it needed to be. It was handed the map to the future by its own engineer, and it spent the next 3 decades folding that map up and putting it back in a drawer, because reading it would have meant burning down the house. There is a lesson here, and it is older than Kodak, older than photography, older than business itself. The thing that makes you powerful is almost always the thing that kills you. Kodak's film monopoly made it one of the richest companies on earth, and then made it incapable of letting film die. Its century of chemical expertise made it untouchable, and then made it unable to think in any language but film. Its identity, as the keeper of the world's memories, made it beloved, and then made it terrified to become anything else. The very strengths that carried Kodak to the summit were the weights that dragged it off the cliff. This is the pattern, in case after case, body after body. Success is not a fortress you build and defend. It is a current you have to keep swimming against, forever. And the moment you decide that what you have is worth more than what you could become, the moment you choose to protect the present instead of investing in the future, the water begins, very quietly, to carry you backward. Kodak's engineer handed it the future in a room in 1975, and the most powerful imaging company in the history of the world looked at that future, understood exactly what it meant, and decided it was safer to keep selling film. They had everything. 90% of the market, 145,000 employees, a brand as trusted as Coca-Cola, the very invention that would define the next half-century of their own industry. And they lost almost all of it. Not in a crash, not in a scandal, not because they could not see what was coming, but because they could see it perfectly and chose, in meeting after meeting, year after year, to look away. That was the fatal decision. The body is closed. The cause of death is recorded. And somewhere out there, right now, another giant is sitting in another room, holding its own version of Steven Sassen's camera, the invention that could save it, and the invention that threatens everything it has, and quietly deciding to put it back in the drawer. If this autopsy taught you something, subscribe and stay with us, because next time there will be another body on the table. There always is. I'll see you in the next examination.